If you listen to the news, if you watch late-night TV, if you're on social media, then you know that it feels like we've almost reached the end. Well, politically speaking, that is. Never before has the country felt so divided and fractured as it does now. The word compromise feels foreign, and the word bipartisan is used like a punchline. It feels like our leaders straight across the board have chosen special interests over those they were elected to serve. It feels like we're at a place we've never been before. But as a researcher and historian, I offer you cause to rejoice. We've been here before, and we've reached the other side. You just got to know that there's a high cost for getting to that other side. Case number 37, Huey Long, the Kingfish. Today on the Noir Factory.
Noir, suspense, true crime, hard-boiled fiction. Explore the dark alleys and cheap gin joints of mob history, noir films, hard-boiled paperbacks, and two-fisted pulp fiction with mystery writer and make-believe detective Stephen Gomez. Grab your fedora and button your lip as you enter the office of the internet's finest fictional detective agency, the Noir Factory.
One of these days, the people of Louisiana are going to get good government. And they're not going to like it. Huey Long. Huey Pierce Long Jr. was born to Huey Pierce Long Sr. and Caledonia Tison Long on August 30th, 1893 in Winnfield, Louisiana. Winnfield was part of a dirt-poor parish, and the wealthy Long family stood out. They were the wealth and class of Winn Parish, and they were community leaders for generations. Huey's grandfather had purchased 640 acres of woods, and he carved out a farm for his family. Huey's father continued that tradition by buying up 320 acres near Winnfield. Huey himself was the seventh of 9 surviving children, and from the day of his birth, expectations were high. His father insisted that the kid should strive to become someone, and that lesson took. Of Huey Long's siblings, 2 became Louisiana governors, 1 later a senator, a U.S. congressman, a district attorney, and 5 became school teachers, 1 at the university level. In such a household, it was hard to stand out, so Huey Long Jr. adopted a strategy that would serve him well for the rest of his life. He was very loud, and he was very proud. Known to be fearless and exuberant, Huey learned to walk at 8 months old, and he would wander out in the house to play with the livestock. He was hard to keep track of, and according to his father, he was forced to build a cover for the family well just in case Huey decided to jump in. In addition to that exuberance, he was thought of as precocious, which is probably a kind description. Wherever he went, he had something to say. If adults were playing checkers, Huey would interrupt and he would tell the man what their next move should be. And if they were speaking politics, pretty much the same. Growing up on a farm, there was plenty of hard physical labor to be done, and young Huey wanted no part of it. He disliked farm work, and he would often get a job in town just to avoid physical labor. He set type at a local paper. He delivered baked goods, but something he particularly enjoyed, something he was particularly skilled at, was the art of sales. He loved to read, even at a place where books were scarce. He liked to know how things worked, and he loved to share that knowledge with others. He was excited about concepts, and he became fanatical about them. When he was baptized at age 13 in a small fish pond near his home, the experience had a profound effect on him. His family, and especially his mother, were devout Baptists, and for a while, Huey considered life as a minister. Although he gave up his religious aspirations, the rest of his life he'd continued to thrive. Another event that had a profound effect on young Huey Long was the foreclosure of a local farm. Winn Parish at the time was a place that embraced populism, the philosophy that the interests of the common man were placed above corporations and the wealthy elite. As young Huey Long shoehorned his way into conversations with adults, he found that most of the concerns regarded social inequalities. He paid attention, and one day, at the steps of this local courthouse, he heard a local farmer beg the crowd not to bid on his farm at the sheriff's auction. None of the neighbors bid, but at the last moment, the local store, who the farmer was in debt to, stepped in and made a bid, capturing the property and leaving the family homeless. And just like that, Huey saw a neighbor rendered homeless by a merciless corporation. And that event, too, would shape how he saw the world. In his early years, Huey Long was homeschooled, and homeschooled well. But around age 11, he started public school. It didn't take long for teachers to see he was ahead of his classmates. He was moved ahead to the 7th grade, and he continued to be above his classmates. But he was also continually bored. At Winnfield High, Huey both enjoyed and excelled at debating, which surprised no one who knew him. In Baton Rouge, he won a state debate championship, which earned him a scholarship, I bet it be a small one, at Louisiana State University. Sadly, he'd never use it. In high school, Huey and his friends founded a secret society by wearing a red ribbon on their lapel. Members of the society were able to recognize one another and assist each other in their goal. That goal, their mission, was defined by Huey Long as simply to run things. He wanted to be the one to lay down certain rules that other students would have to follow. Once teachers got wind of this mini Illuminati Huey was putting together, he was warned to stop and follow the rules. And that never sat well with Huey, and he continued to rebel. He published a flyer denouncing his teachers, as well as calling for repeal of the recently state-mandated 12th grade. He was expelled in 1910, right before he graduated. In typical Huey Long fashion, he fought the decision tooth and nail. He drafted a petition to have the principal of the high school expelled, and he managed to get enough people in the parish to sign, so it cost the principal his position. Despite winning this battle, however, Huey was done with most formal education. For the next 3 years, he traveled south, working as a salesman. He did other things also. He sold books, canned goods, and even medicinal elixirs. He also worked as an auctioneer, but as a salesman, he was still a natural. In 1911, he met Rose McConnell, a stenographer from Greensburg, Indiana. Rose had moved to Louisiana, and she had met Huey when she was competing for a baking contest he was hosting for cottonelle, a popular vegetable shortening. The two were engaged for 3 years, and they were married in Memphis, Tennessee, at the Gray Sorrow Hotel on April 12, 1913. And even though Huey grew up in a wealthy family, he was years past seeing any money from his father. Flat broke on the day of his wedding, Huey borrowed $10 from Rose to pay the minister. It was during World War I. Jobs were scarce. At the urging of his mother, Huey took seminary classes in Oklahoma Baptist University in Shawnee, Oklahoma. It wasn't a good fit. He barely went to class, and he soon stopped attending altogether. The experience did, however, open him up to possibilities he'd never really considered. He felt a career in law, particularly arguing cases, would be a vocation that suited him. With that in mind, he borrowed $300 from his brother, and he left Shawnee for Oklahoma City, where he planned to work hard, earn his law degree, pass the bar, and take his place among the honorable men of the Oklahoma Bar Association. The first thing he did, however, was lose the $100 his brother loaned him gambling on roulette. Still, he managed to get to the University of Oklahoma College of Law in Norman for a semester in 1912. There he worked part-time as a salesman in his usual fallback position, and he attended a few classes. Very few. He ended that single semesters with 3 C's and 1 incomplete, but the experience was enough for Huey. There was too much excitement, all those gambling houses and everything, Huey later said. Besides, he was confident he could get things done his way. He spent a few more years traveling as a salesman before enrolling successfully in Tulane University in New Orleans in 1914. There he attended classes for about a year before he convinced the state board to let him try the bar exam, and he passed it on the first try. The next year, Huey set up a small practice in Winn, but later moved it to Shreveport. There, he set out to help the, quote, common man, unquote, and he claimed that he never took a case against a poor man. To underscore that point, he successfully represented a local widow in a case against the Winnfield Bank. The president of the bank was his uncle. In 1918, Huey Long invested in an oil well that had the good fortune to strike oil. Thinking himself a millionaire, he found that Standard Oil, who at the time had a virtual monopoly on Louisiana oil, was not buying. Looking for other buyers and finding none, Huey had to eat his investment and lost money in a successful oil venture. And that episode soured Huey against big business. He called the corporation the Invisible Empire, and he called the board members petroleum-ites. And while his disdain of corporations grew in general, his hatred of Standard Oil in particular festered. The same year Huey lost his oil investment, he ran for a seat on the Louisiana Railroad Commission. He ran as a Democrat, and in his flyers referred to himself as a true man of the people. He lost the election to the incumbent, Burke Bridges. Since no candidate received a majority of the votes, however, a runoff election was required. Huey campaigned tirelessly across the North, and he played to his strengths. He lost the urban areas, like Shreveport, but he energized the rural counties, and that won him the majority. And before Huey Long was elected, the Louisiana Railroad Commission was just a figurehead commission that existed to serve the heads of state government. As soon as he got there, Huey changed all that in his first days in office. Again on a platform representing the common man, Huey exerted pressure on the railroads to extend their services in the counties and smaller villages that supported him. He wanted to lower utility rates for the people, and he also wanted to force Standard Oil, his hated foe, to rely less on foreign oil and more on Louisiana oil. Huey was seeing success on the state level that few expected, and it seemed to spur him on. In 1920, he backed John M. Parker for governor of Louisiana. Again, he worked tirelessly in the northern parishes, and he was responsible for securing the North, and by extension, the office of governor for Parker. Shortly after Parker's victory, however, the two men had a falling out. It was said that they couldn't agree on Huey's idea of having Standard Oil's pipeline declared a public utility. It never happened, and Parker even went so far as to ask Standard Oil lawyers to assist him in writing the state's new tax bill. Huey went on to characterize Parker as a dupe of the corporations. Parker sought to have Huey ousted from his position at the Railroad Commission. Instead, the opposite happened. In 1922, the Railroad Commission was renamed the Public Service Commission, and its purview widened. Huey retained a seat there, and he expanded both his reputation and his power. That same year, Huey argued a case against the Cumberland Telephone and Telegraph Company for unfair rate increases for Louisiana customers. He took the case all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court, where he won a cash refund for his constituents. At the time, Supreme Court Justice William Howard Taft described Huey Long as one of the best legal minds he had ever encountered. In 1924, Huey ran as governor of Louisiana, attacking Standard Oil and John M. Parker. He spoke out against corruption, monopolies, and even the Ku Klux Klan, a huge force in Louisiana politics. Long lost his bid for governor. He came in third, and he blamed the Klan for suppressing voter turnout by blocking roads to polling places. And he blamed Standard Oil for supporting what he described as a puppet governor. But like any setback Huey went through, Huey Long learned from the experience. In that unsuccessful bid for governor, he was a pioneer in using radio to address the public, as well as sound trucks that would travel neighborhoods with a giant speaker on the roof, blaring Huey Long's message to prospective voters. He wore white linen suits at every appearance, and the suit became his trademark. He billed himself as a common man candidate, but that still wasn't quite enough. He needed to build support, and he had 4 years in which to do it. He retained a seat on the Public Service Commission, and he continued to paint himself as a common man, but he also reached out for other parts of the state. The southern part of Louisiana, with its Spanish and French influences, was heavily Roman Catholic. Meeting with leaders in the churches and communities there, Huey convinced them that he, rather than the elite politicos of Baton Rouge, had their best interest in heart. He ran once again for governor in 1928, staying very true to his brand, with the slogan, "Every man a king, but no one wears a crown." It was a catchphrase that harkened back to Democrat William Jennings Bryan, who himself was billed a man of the people. Once again, Huey built on the resentment of the disenfranchised rural voters, painting the urban leadership as parasites. At the same time, while Huey Long was immensely popular in the rural parish, this time he also made inroads into poor city living voters. And while over 60% of Louisiana voters favored Huey, poll taxes and selective literacy tests kept black voters and farmers away from polling places. In some parishes, bridges and ferries leading to polling places were expensive, too expensive for Huey's base to afford, and they cut into Huey's advantage. Huey continued to paint current government as working against the people, and he managed to get his opponents to agree to a free bridge over Lake Pontchartrain, a major impediment to getting voters to the poll. While waiting for construction of the bridges, he arranged for ferries to operate at 50 cents a person, as opposed to the previous 1928 price of $8.40 per person. Huey Long won the Democratic primary, but again not by a majority. This time, however, his opponents choose not to compete in a runoff. He then went on to defeat the Republican nominee, Entente Jean Kerr, with over 96% of the popular vote, a huge mandate from the people. Almost immediately, Long moved to shore up the Democratic front. He called on Randolph Hetch, the president of the Hibernian Bank, who was a powerful community ally, as well as T. Sims Walmsley, the mayor of New Orleans, to make sure that other Democrats fell in line behind their governor. And they brought their constituents to the table. Once in office, Huey fired every public servant that he thought might have remotely resisted his tenure. From cabinet positions to dog catcher, he filled the vacancies with political cronies who may or may not have been capable of doing their job. Once he secured his control over the municipality, he demanded that every state employee that owed his job to the governor contribute a portion of their check to the governor's political war chest. The amount generated through his tax was as incredible as it was unethical. And in the book Freedom from Fear, The American People in Depression and War, 1929 to 1945, David Kennedy wrote that the Huey Long regime in Louisiana was the closest thing to a dictatorship America has ever known. In keeping with his image, as well as his promises to the rural and poorer constituents, Huey undertook a huge public work program that built bridges, roads, hospitals, and schools. He even greenlit a literacy program for adults in Louisiana, as well as the controversial practice of giving free textbooks to the elementary school children. Always ahead of his time, Huey Long championed in Louisiana, almost 100 years ago, what we take for granted today. He trusted his vision, but he was still ruthless against anyone who might oppose it, for any reason. In one rural parish, the citizens felt honor-bound to prevent textbooks for their children. They thanked the governor for his thoughts, but they turned down what they perceived as charity. Huey retaliated for this slight by holding up a public works project that would have brought work to the impoverished parish until they relented and accepted the textbooks. In the capital, Huey grew to use similar tactics to ensure his political success. He made it a habit of showing up unannounced on the floor of the House or the Senate, and even in closed committee meetings, and bullying those who stood in his way. There were a few political leaders who opposed Huey in Louisiana, such as his lieutenant governor, Paul Narcisse Cyr, a fellow Democrat, the Attorney General Percy Saint, and the mayor who had previously endorsed him, T. Sims Walmsley. The three often stood against Long, but they were steamrolled by his popularity and his political machine. The people of Louisiana loved Huey Long, and he felt that Louisiana would just be the starting point for him. During Huey's reign as governor, there were two attempts at impeachment. The first came in 1929. In order to raise money for social programs, Huey passed a 5-cent per barrel occupational license tax on refined oil. The tax hit his favorite foe, Standard Oil, the hardest. When the bill went to the state legislature, opponents of Huey, led by freshman congressmen Cecil Morgan and Ralph Norman Baer, moved to impeach Long on everything from abuse of power to blasphemy. A good old-fashioned fistfight broke out, and the resulting brawl moved across both the House and the Senate. Long tried to cut the sessions short, but his opponents managed to keep it going, and impeachment proceedings continued. As they did, Long discovered that Standard Oil had increased their advertising with papers that opposed him. From the pulpit, Long railed against the oil companies, telling the public that they stood in the way of constructing roads, bridges, and providing school books for Louisiana's children. As Louisiana's House debated on Huey's impeachment, he went to the Senate, and he produced a round-robin statement signed by 15 senators saying the charges against Long were fraudulent and they warranted no impeachment. The senators also pledged to vote not guilty in any proceeding against Governor Huey Long. And with the round-robin document in hand, Huey successfully fended off his first impeachment attempt. But he was personally affronted by it. The senators who signed the round-robin bill were rewarded with state jobs and other favors, but his enemies had to be dealt with. Since the majority of Louisiana papers were against Huey, he decided to found his own, the Louisiana Progress. With that, he boasted his accomplishments and he denounced his enemies. He also extracted payments from companies seeking government contracts by having them purchase expensive advertisements in the progress. As for the politicians that stood against him, Huey would support their opponents, whoever they may be, and in cases where there were no opposition, he would create some. His Progress newspaper would run editorials tearing away at his opponents, and if any of their relatives or friends had government jobs, they found themselves unemployed. Huey's tactics were successful, but they had a price. Death threats were constant, and security around the governor had to be increased. In 1930, Huey announced he would run for the U.S. Senate. He ran on his accomplishments, as well as his public support, and he called his campaign a referendum on his term as governor. He promised that he would resign from governor if he lost his bid for the Senate. He defeated the incumbent, a 3-term Democrat, Joseph E. Randall, by 15 points, and he was posed to become the U.S. Senator on March 4th, 1931. But he was also Louisiana's governor, and that was a position Huey wasn't quite ready to abandon. Rather than letting Lieutenant Governor Paul Cryer succeed him as the governor, Huey declared that leaving the U.S. Senate seat vacant wasn't a huge issue, since with Randall, the seat was vacant anyway. With Long's political capital at an all-time high, he gathered the support of urban Democrats of Baton Rouge, Louisiana, those who had traditionally resisted him, and Long put forward a series of highway bills based on gasoline tax. Those bills would create a new state capitol building, school construction, and create a highway system that was the most modern in the country. And those who stood against him did so at their own risk. And it was during this time, with friends who were fans of the popular Amos and Andy radio show, Huey received his nickname, the Kingfish. The character was a smooth-talking salesman who tried to swindle money from his friends, and it was a nickname that Huey encouraged. While Huey's Senate seat remained vacant, his control over Louisiana tightened, much to the chagrin of his lieutenant governor, Paul Cryer. Cryer argued that the Senate-elect held 2 offices at once and could no longer be permitted to be governor. In a bold course of action, he declared himself the governor of Louisiana. Huey saw this as a coup d'etat, and he ordered the National Guard to surround the state capitol to repel any offense by Cryer. He then went to the state Supreme Court and requested that they remove Cryer as lieutenant governor, claiming he had abandoned his office in his attempt to claim governorship. The court agreed with Huey, and they removed Cryer as lieutenant governor. In his place, Huey appointed the state president and his political ally, Alvin Olin King, as the new lieutenant governor. With King as lieutenant, Huey chose his schoolhood friend, Oscar K. Allen, to run as the Democratic candidate for governor and his successor. Campaigning for Allen as a continue-the-work governor, King won handily, and Huey could take a seat in the Senate, confident that his power base in Louisiana was secure. Huey Long arrived in Washington, D.C. to take his Senate seat in January of 1932. And as a shadow of the Great Depression grew over the country, Huey's familiar populist stance of share the wealth continued to gain followers across the country. Before coming to Washington, Huey Long was an ardent supporter of Franklin Roosevelt. As the Great Depression raged on, Huey, being the governor of Louisiana, had a front row seat to the poverty that was eating away at America, and he applauded Roosevelt's attempt to use government to combat that poverty. Using the power of his personality, as well as his ability to bring a crowd to a frenzy, he spoke on behalf of Roosevelt and other Democrats in the Senate, going so far as to propel Hattie Caraway, an underdog Arkansas Democrat, into office as one of the first female senators in the U.S. He continued to champion his populist views, but his trust in fellow Democrats began to falter. In the first 100 days of Roosevelt's presidency, Huey opposed the National Recovery Act and saw it as a sellout to big business. When the Glass-Steagall Act, a provision for providing insurance to national banks on bank holdings, came to the floor, Huey led a 3-week filibuster, resulting in state banks receiving the same federal guarantees that national banks had. Not afraid to go up against a president who he now saw as betraying his party to big business, he was making a name for himself on a national stage. The New York Times called Huey a man with a front of brass and lungs of leather. Roosevelt himself called him, along with MacArthur, 2 of the most dangerous men in America. The president's mother referred to Huey as that horrible man, and his friends, They knew him as the Kingfish still. In D.C., he drank openly, he womanized frequently, he constantly wore those ridiculous white suits and pink ties, and he enjoyed mocking his critics. Already losing the support of the president, he now openly referred to the president as Frank. In meetings with the president of the United States, he refused to stand or take off his straw hat. Roosevelt was at his boiling point with the Louisiana senator, and he used some of Huey's own political games against him. The president appointed Long's political enemies to direct federal programs in Louisiana, and he cut Huey out of the loop regarding planning or developments in his home state. Roosevelt also supported a Senate inquiry on election fraud and voter intimidation in Louisiana against several of Long's allies. Other allies were under investigation by the IRS. In 1934, Huey was given time on the Senate floor to discuss the Platt Amendment. Instead, he spoke out about the Chaco War and what Huey saw as a sovereign Paraguay fighting a corporate titan, his friend Standard Oil. Huey painted Standard Oil as international thieves and murderers, and he took pleasure in being able to do so from the floor of the U.S. Senate. This behavior didn't win him any friends in the Senate. In fact, Huey's entire time in the Senate, not a single bill, resolution, or motion from Huey Long was passed. It was said that he couldn't get the Lord's Prayer endorsed by the Senate. Still, Huey kept a good face on for the public and had nothing but praise for a party he had little loyalty to and a president he despised. And the people in his party, particularly the people of Louisiana, still had nothing but love for their populist politician. He spent little time on the actual Senate floor. In fact, he was absent for more than half the days in the 1932 session. Instead, he continued to hold rallies, bolstering the support of his populist views. He also made sure that his will was being enforced in his home state. Huey constantly made trips to Louisiana to maintain his power base there. And while he was there, he took over the office of the governor, and he would draft bills he expected to pass, despite having absolutely no official power to do so. He gave speeches in Louisiana, again with the theme of every man a king. He continued to make surprise appearances in the House and Senate chambers, and even in committees, or any place he felt his will might not be followed. And although his loyal minion, Oscar K. Allen, was still the actual governor of Louisiana, and although he still continued to govern according to Huey's will, the Kingfish berated him in speeches. He used his federal power to break small parishes that might oppose him, and he consolidated the power to the position of the governor, a position he controlled completely. Attacking the newspapers for voicing their opinions against him, Huey imposed a 2% lying tax on them. To make sure that the will of the governor was followed, he created a Bureau of Criminal Identification. The Bureau was made up of plainclothes officers who answered only to the governor. In Louisiana, Huey Long's power was now absolute. In Washington, D.C., though, there was still a lot of work to be done. In the Senate, Huey was still as unpopular as ever, but his intent was to be heard far away from the halls of the Capitol. In March of 1933, he introduced what he called the Long Plan to redistribute the wealth of the nation. The plan was designed to cap personal wealth at $100 million. In the plan, a fortune of $1 million was taxed at 1%, a fortune of $2 million at 2%. A fortune of over $100 million was seized by the government. Additionally, his plan called for personal yearly income to be capped at $1 million and inheritance at $5 million. Now, never mind that the plan could never be approved by Congress. And never mind that no sitting president would ever sign such a thing. Also, never mind that the numbers were so off that the plan would result in a net worth of a few $100s per year for each family. Hardly enough to tear apart a nation. Never mind all that. Instead, imagine what hordes of America, standing in bread lines and living in shelters, what they thought of such talk. They thought this strange man from Louisiana, this odd guy who wore white suits and straw hats, was willing to do more for them than any politician had ever done, at a time when they needed it the most. They would listen to this Kingfish, even if Washington, D.C. would not. He published his autobiography, Every Man a King, and immediately started work on a second book, one with the most egotistical title of any man not running for president. It was called My First Days in the White House. It was said that Huey Long worked with Father Charles Coughlin, a religious priest and radio figure with a populist voice almost as powerful as Huey's. Neither man endorsed Roosevelt, and it was assumed that the splintering of the Democratic Party would result in a third party that was to the left of both parties and more popular than either. Despite not officially running for office, other than the ones he previously held, the Kingfish went into full campaign mode, championing a new economic plan to the people. Long's Share the Wealth plan was similar to his Long plan, but this plan was more political in nature, and it was designed to operate outside of the Democratic Party and free of Roosevelt's influence. Share the Wealth clubs were created across the country, and Huey Long would speak to them in rallies and over the radio. He continued to preach wealth distribution and populism, and the message stuck. By 1935, there were 27,000 Share the Wealth clubs in the United States, and they were 7.5 million members strong. Huey Long had amassed astounding political capital, and there was absolutely no one in Washington who thought he wouldn't use it to his own benefit. But he didn't get that chance. On September 8, 1935, Huey once again visited his home state. This time, he was on a mission to oust a political opponent, Judge Benjamin Henry Pavey. The judge had proven an obstacle for Long in Louisiana, and that was something the Kingfish wouldn't abide. In a rather controversial story, Huey was shot in the torso by Pavey's son-in-law, Carl Weiss, a local physician and a father from Baton Rouge. It was said that the physician killed Huey with a single shot, and that he himself was killed instantly with return fire from Huey's bodyguards. Huey's last words were, "I wonder what will happen to my poor university boys." Or they might have been, "I still have so much to do." It really all depends on who you believe. There's still a lot of questions regarding Huey's assassination. And if you're looking for an in-depth look at Carl Weiss and the assassination of Huey Long, you won't find a better account than Criminal Podcast, episode number 36, The Kingfish. Tell him the Noir Factory says hi. As for Huey Long, the Kingfish, he lay in state at the Louisiana State Capitol Rotunda in a double casket made of bronze and a coffin lid of glass. He was presented in a white tuxedo, and it's estimated that 200,000 mourners entered Baton Rouge for his funeral, with tens of thousands in attendance. Huey Long was buried in the new state capitol that he championed, and a statue of him resides at his grave, depicting his achievements for the people of Louisiana. Inside the hall of the Capitol, a plaque marks the site of his assassination. That's it this week for the Noir Factory. Join us next time for true crime, hard-boiled fiction, and the best in noir. I'm Steve Gomez. Good night.
Psst, still there? This week's special Noir Factory Dakota message is coming right up. Crack the code by visiting thenoirfactory.com/key.
3-19-3-22-21. 13-23-2-23. 8-4-2-16. That is all. For the key to this code, visit thenoirfactory.com/key. That's noirfactory.com/key. Good night.